Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Forgotten Scriptures podcast. This is episode 5, the Apocryphal Psalms. Hope you are all doing well, as I am. It has been a good long month, so we're back on. We're keeping our schedule. I'm going to try to keep it, as I said, about 1 month for every episode. Do this monthly, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different compared to last time. Now, in the last episode we did a very extensive deep dive into the Apocryphon of Ezekiel, the literature, the apocryphal Ezekiel literature alongside that found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We did a very big deep dive. That was the longest episode yet. Today we're going to be keeping it a little bit lighter, and we're going to be looking into a varied set of material categorized as the Apocryphal Psalms. Or in the text I'm going to be reading from today, it's categorized as more Psalms of David. Although that is not necessarily the case. Anyhow, now the Book of Psalms, as everyone would recognize, is one of the most famous books of the Bible and one of the most extensively used throughout Christian history, whether by laymen in liturgy in the high churches. In some traditions, only the Psalms are actually sung in church. These, and as well, the Psalms also differ according to different traditions. If you come from a Protestant or Catholic background, your Psalms are ordered different to the ordering of the Psalms in the Coptic, not Coptic, but the Oriental and Orthodox churches would have a different ordering, plus an extra psalm, Psalm 151, which is actually going to be part of this category. So the Book of Psalms is very extensive, from use among laymen, use in liturgy, use among monastics in Christian history, and also in Judaism, where the text originally originates. It is one of the most profound books in Judaism, Christianity, and it is even influenced in Islam. And there is material from the Psalms in the Quran where it is called the Zabur of Dawood, or David. Now, the Book of Psalms was compiled over a long period of time, starting probably around the time of David, although I would think there would be material in it that is older than David. But the material, David is considered the principal author of the Book of Psalms, although much of the material is from other authors, named and unnamed. And many of the Psalms were likely not written by David himself, but are ascribed to him later, not necessarily pseudonymously, but done to add a narrative element to the Psalms. But the book was continually compiled over a long period of time, hundreds of years, until the Second Temple period. And even then, it was modified, and scribes were engaged in adding psalms and modifying material, adding doxologies, to where the Book of Psalms as we have it today is a final product of a long history of redaction. Now, where some books, for example, like the Book of Job, seems to be a generally solid text, there might be some redaction here or there. It is among the wisdom literature, or for example, the Wisdom of Solomon, or the Wisdom of Syriac, where we have a fairly solid text. The Book of Psalms is from a single author. The Book of Psalms is a very vast, multifaceted, multi-era text. Multiple authors added their material to it. So the Book of Psalms is a panorama and a mosaic of ancient Yahwism and Judaism as it evolved and changed during the early period of the Davidic dynasty, the United Kingdom, the divided kingdoms, and so forth. The Book of Psalms is divided into 5 books, much like the Pentateuch, and that's likely where it's based upon. And 150 Psalms is the Hebrew reckoning of the Psalms, is 150. The first 2 Psalms are introductory, and then it's followed by 5 more books of material, and then a concluding collection of Psalms, which are Psalms 146 to 150, that is a kind of climactic praise. But in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, compiled in the 2nd century, or not compiled, but translated in the 2nd century BC. at some point, an extra psalm was attached to the Septuagint tradition, and this is Psalm 151. Now, for those who are Eastern Orthodox or in the Oriental tradition, they will recognize this psalm as part of their biblical canon, and it is simply kind of forgotten in the other traditions in Protestantism and Catholicism. But Psalm 151 has had a history and has been preserved because it has simply been, interestingly enough, kind of tacked on to the end of the book of Psalms, and is even recognized by its heading, as we shall see, as outside the number, as it would be called. So it's this peculiar case of an apocryphal psalm being in another canon that is not included in either other Christian or Jewish collections of the Psalms. But that is not the only case of differences in the Psalms, because as we shall see, the community at Qumran that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and translated the material and wrote them or translated them, so forth, also had different versions of psalm books. Now, this could simply be a case of them having their own book of psalms, or we shall see. There's a lot of debate over this, what exactly is going on. But they composed their own material and had their own versions of the book of Psalms. And so, even by the time of Jesus himself, the book of Psalms was not necessarily canonized in a single form as we know it today. And it took a little while to split off into the Masoretic and the Septuagint lineages, as we know, with different numeration and also an additional psalm in the Septuagint's case. And that would eventually go off and become the Latin Vulgate and so forth. Now, the material found at the Dead Sea Scrolls is important here, but as well, the Syriac tradition, which is the dialect of Aramaic, also has apocryphal psalms, some of which come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, as we shall see, the apocryphal psalms are actually part of this continuum of an evolving kind of inconsistent book of psalms that can have different psalms at different time periods and in different cultures and periods. So this book of Psalms is in fact very fluid, more fluid than most of the books of the Bible, as we shall see. Now, I'm going to be reading from the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, Volume 2, by James H. Charlesworth, in a specific section entitled More Psalms of David. And it was the translations and the introduction were done by Charlesworth himself and J.A. Sanders. And I'm going to read their introduction here. And the way this is laid out is there are introductions and many footnotes, but I can only be careful here. I don't want to get lost in the sauce with the footnotes, because I am tempted to do that very often. But that would drag things down. And so these all have introductions to them. And so I'm going to actually read along and follow the material in the book here, so we can have a proper outline and structure to our study of this material. I think there's anything else I should say about the book of Psalms. But what we have, well, I guess I'll do it myself, but what we have necessarily here are pseudepigraphic psalms as well, written in the names of other individuals, like David. The headings to psalms, as well, as another phenomena that's important to take note of, is that the headings of a psalm don't necessarily have to be original, nor are they necessary to a text, because they differ between the traditions. Now, in a Protestant or Catholic Bible, the headings to their psalms are going to be different from that of a Eastern Christian's book of Psalms. And the situation is that you can get a lot of these debates over, well, is this inspired, is this not inspired? And I think we have to take an approach that the biblical canon is very fluid. And the headings of psalms and the numbering of psalms, and in fact the amount of psalms we have in our Bible, have been ever changing, and there have been cases where there was material included in a text that is no longer there. And so understanding inspiration as a kind of flowing and free moving thing, for those who believe in the doctrine of inspiration of a text, has to be understood in the context of history, as books change and are modified in time, and there are different translations. As we shall see here, we are going to be dealing with texts who have headings that are in some cases completely unrelated to the psalm that have been added on, and this can seem kind of strange. But the fact is that our psalms in our own Bibles, for those of us who are Christians, are going to have headings that are probably added later from when the psalm was actually written, and that's completely normal and that's completely fine. What it does is it can help add an interpretive lens to the material, and if you have different ones, it actually adds another layer to the text. So when we understand the apocryphal material, to understand that these are part of another tradition in history. It could have very well been the case that we ended up with an 155 book of Psalms in certain traditions, such as the Syriac. But, as fate would have it, and God would have it, that did not be the case. However, there could be some crazy situation in history, stranger things have happened, where eventually a book of Psalms will come together with these Psalms I'm speaking about. Because nothing is necessarily set in solid. And the way it works, for example, as we see in Eastern Orthodoxy, the biblical canon is in fact not definitively closed. So you have this situation where there's not a specific count. There is a collection of books and really not more. So there is a quote-unquote canon of the Eastern Orthodox, but it is still kind of open. And with the Catholics did canonize a specific set of books. That does not mean that books can not be added to it. It just simply means that books cannot be taken away. So it is a possibility. For example, if there were church reunions, that some books can be added to a canon. And this is an interesting prospect, although maybe most of us here will probably not, if any of us will ever live to see that actually happen, although I wish we could see biblical canons arise that are much different than what we've seen for the past 2,000 years or so. And so this is a little glimpse into the fluid history of one of the most important books of Scripture. But that's my 11-minute introduction here, so I'm going to try to move on and actually let Charlesworth and Sanders speak for themselves, the actual academics who know what they're talking about. So it states here, the canonical Old Testament in Hebrew, the Masoretic Bible, contains 150 psalms, yet 5 more psalms of David and part of a 6th, 151b, are now recognized. The disparate date and character of these additional psalms are best represented by discussing and translating them individually. The early pre-Christian date and Jewish character of 4 of these psalms, Psalms 151a, 151b, 154, and 155, is proved by the discovery that they are extant in the Qumran Psalms Scroll 11Q Psalms A, which dates from the first half of the 1st century AD. Despite the disparateness that separate these psalms, there may be an organic relationship between them, and earlier ones may have inspired later ones. This possibility arises with the recognition that Psalms 151a and b, 152 and 53 are all influenced by the tradition recorded in 1 Samuel 16 and 17, according to which David slew both lions and bears, and defeated the Philistine Goliath, eventually cutting off his head with the giant's own sword. Now, in the category, so these are the ones we have to deal with, and then, as we shall see, 151, the more famous psalm that I mentioned here, actually has a bunch of wrinkles in it, as we shall see, that are very fascinating. But these are how they're categorized: 151 A and B, and then of course 52 to 55. Now, the text here, where we have this material preserved, he states, Psalm 151 is preserved in the Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac. Psalms 152 and 153 only in Syriac. Psalms 154 and 155 in Hebrew and Syriac. Generally speaking, the Hebrew, because it is earlier and the language of the original, is to be preferred over the other texts. The translation of the Greek and Hebrew is based upon the addition by Sanders. The translation of the Syriac is based upon the addition by W. Bars, and he says the sigla are as follows. A is Baghdad Library of the Chaldean Patriarchate, manuscript 1113, of circa the 12th century. It says this manuscript was once in Mosul. It is our base text. So this is coming from the 1100s from Mosul. B, from manuscript B from London, the British Museum, of the 6th century, so that's the 500s AD. And J.R.L. Syriac 7, Manchester, John Ryland's Library, Syriac Manuscript 7 of the 16th century. So that's from the 1500s, and it says it contains only Psalm 151 of the pseudepigraphical Psalms. And he says here, this unexamined version of Psalm 151 was discovered by Charles Worth while working on a catalog of Syriac manuscripts in the John Rylands Library. So I guess that's not important, but always check the footnotes. Here's my, as I said, lost in the sauce with the footnotes. I always check them. But those are our three general manuscripts that we will be using as the sources for the material we'll be looking at. He notes here in the category on collective importance, he says, some distinguished scholars have argued that one or more of these pseudepigraphical psalms were composed by the Essenes, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most scholars, however, conclude correctly that while some passages can be interpreted in line with Essene theology, this possibility does not indicate that these psalms were composed by the Essenes, who shared ideas with other Jews contemporaneous with them. The presence of these psalms within the Qumran Psalter, that's 11q Psalms A, raises the question of the extent of the Davidic Psalter prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. At Qumran, of course, the Psalter was appreciably different from the present collection in Hebrew, but what was the shape of the Psalter elsewhere? M. H. Goshen Gottstein has argued that the Psalter was already set and canonized by the 2nd century BC, and that excerpts from it, along with apocryphal compositions, were placed in 11q Psalm A, which is therefore the earliest Jewish prayer book. A similar interpretation is defended by P. Skahan, who contends that 11q Psalms A is a library edition of the standard collection of 150 psalms. The presence of apocryphal psalms such as the Prayer of Manasseh and the Psalms of Solomon, which were considered inspired by many Jews around the turn of the era, along with the presence of apocryphal psalms in the Dead Sea Scrolls, indicate the distinction between the canonical and apocryphal psalms had not been clarified before the advent of Christianity. And he notes here the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll, Psalm Scroll, says contains other pseudepigraphical psalms than the 5 apocryphal Syriac psalms, and it preserves a prose account of psalms attributed to David, stating that the total was 4,050, which is clearly an inflated figure that lauds David's genius. J. Strugnell has found another Psalm of David in LAB 59. He concludes, quote, as a general observation, let us call attention to the fact that like Psalms 151 A and B and Psalm 152, this is clearly a Davidic pseudepigraphon ex persona David. And so the material in the Qumran Scrolls adds material to it as bookending the book of Psalms. And again, there's more of these. There's plenty of these apocryphal Psalms. We're going to just be looking at these ones that have been found in the Greek, the Hebrew, and the Syriac. And there are many more. There are other material included found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are ascribed to David. So there are much more. We could devote another episode to this entirely, but I want to stick to these in particular because of the Syriac connection to all of these Psalms, as they're all found in the Syriac and were preserved there, unlike some of these other Psalms that are only found in Qumran. And he notes here on the translation, he says, the translation attempts to be as literal as intelligible English will allow, so that comparisons can be made between the Syriac and the Hebrew. For a convenient collection of divergent translations, he goes on the Dead Sea Scrolls with Sanders, Syriac and Hebrew words are translated consistently by the same English word when possible. Cognate words are translated identically. So the translation we're going to be reading is very literal, which will benefit, I think, for this podcast. Close my book here. So our first psalm is Psalm 151. He states here, the original language of this psalm is Hebrew. The Syriac of Psalm 151 derives from the Greek, but in Psalms 52 to 55 it comes directly from the Hebrew. A mere cursory comparison of the Syriac and Hebrew of Psalms 51 to 55 reveals that the Syriac of 151a and 151b, in contrast to Psalms 154 and 55, is dissimilar to the Hebrew. The Syriac of 151 is similar and dependent upon the Greek. Originally, Psalm 151 was 2 separate psalms, 151 and 151b. Unfortunately, the latter is lost because this section of 11q Psalms is mutilated. The Greek and Syriac have truncated both psalms. So the version that we have preserved in the Eastern Orthodox tradition is in fact a truncated version of the material found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's actually shortened and condensed, a kind of easier to read version of it, where material has been cut out, and it preserves material at the end of it that actually was part of another psalm. So in a sense, we are actually only have half of the original psalm, which is quite peculiar. We have another psalm that's been included in part of Psalm 151. It states here, Psalm 151 must predate the 2nd century BC. It is in the Greek, which antedates that period. F.M. Cross has argued recently that, quote, no case can it be later, that in, quote, no case can it be later than the 3rd century BCE. This early date certainly dismisses the possibility that Psalm 151 was composed by the members of the Qumran community, which did not originate until the middle of the 2nd century BC. So this psalm is incredibly ancient. It's one of the oldest ones, if not the oldest of all these material we'll be looking at. Before verse 2, there is a line that is a later interpolation. The line is as follows, quote, and I discovered a lion and a wolf, and I killed and rent them, unquote. The idea is intrusive to the thought of the psalm. It is also not preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is only in the margins of manuscript A, the most reliable Syriac tradition, and is missing in JRL Syriac 7. The line has been interpolated from Psalms 152 and 153. So I'm going to read Psalm 151a and b from the Dead Sea Scrolls here, 11Q Psalms A, 151. From the Hebrew, a hallelujah of David the son of Jesse, 151a. I was the smallest among my brothers and the youngest among the sons of my father, and he made me shepherd over his flocks and the ruler over his kids. My hands made a flute and my fingers a lyre, and I shall render glory to the Lord. I thought within myself, the mountains cannot witness to him, nor the hills proclaim him. The trees have elevated my words, and the flocks my deeds. For who can proclaim, and who can announce, and who can recount the deeds of the Lord? Everything God has seen, everything he has heard, and he has listened. He sent his prophet to anoint me, Samuel to make me great. My brothers went out to meet him, handsome of figure and handsome of appearance. Although their stature was tall and their hair handsome, the Lord God did not choose them. But he sent and took me from behind the flock, and he anointed me with holy oil, and he made me leader of his people and ruler over the sons of his covenant. And so that is the 151a. So here we have quite peculiar compared to the Psalms, a very detailed account written by another author in the voice of David at a later period here, describing his as a young shepherd, as a player of the lute and the flute as well. And interesting statements about the mountains not able to witness to God, which we shall see here in the footnotes we'll look at, and who can recount the deeds of the Lord, asking this question, who can understand the greatness of God? And then we have the recounting of David being anointed by the prophet Samuel, and also the him becoming the ruler over the sons of his covenant. And he notes, Charles Worth, I'm assuming this is Charles Worth here, notes in the footnotes, he says, it is amazing that the portions of the leather upon which this psalm is written are preserved without a lacuna, so there is no damage here. The script is easy to read. And he says, compare the material to the Hymn of the Pearl, which is a Gnostic hymn found among the Acts of the Apostle Thomas. When I was a little lad in the dwelling in my kingdom, the house of my father. So it's a very similar line to what we see here. And he has some footnotes here. If I can find the exact correct one. Good, this gets very, very intense, but try to follow me here on the material. He says here in the line, the mountains cannot witness to him, nor the hills proclaim him. The trees have elevated my words, and the flocks my deeds. He says, or, you can translate it, nor the trees elevate my words, and the flocks my deeds. The translation of this verse is problematic. The was and yods are very similar in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The poetic structure open to more than one possibility. Numerous translations have been defended. Strugnell renders this verse as follows. The mountains cannot witness to him, nor the hills proclaim about him, nor the trees proclaim his words, nor the flocks his deeds. Some scholars argue that verse 3a should be read so that the Hebrew is ly and not lw. The mountains cannot witness to me, italics mine. Verses 2b and 3 are not preserved in the Syriac, as can be seen by comparing the two translations above. They are also missing in the Greek and Latin. In contrast to Isaiah 55:12, verse 3 claims that the mountains and hills cannot witness to the Lord. If the verse implies that the trees and flocks do not receive and enjoy David's words and deeds, then Sanders is certainly right in suggesting that these verses might exhibit overtones from traditions relating to Orpheus, who is the mythical Greek shepherd musician. Sanders wisely cautions that this possibility is rather tenuous, but if it is correct, 11Q Psalms 151 preserves the only literary evidence of an Orphic David, who is well known in mosaics and paintings. Also, the Orphic fragments in the supplement of the present work, yet it should be pointed out that the Old Latin and some copies of the Septuagint understood verse 4b to say that God hears everything, reflecting 1 Samuel 16:7. Dupont-Sommer accepts Sanders' suggestion of Orphic overtones in 151 and sees in it an allusion to the Pythagorean concept of the harmony of the world and music of the spheres. Other scholars have been critical to Sanders' suggestion, but it has been defended rigorously by J. Magne. The omission of 2b and 3 in Syriac and Greek should be explained. Perhaps the Greek scribe, the Syriac, is dependent upon the Septuagint, like the Arab of the pseudo-David Psalter, as I mentioned, HTR 59, corrected David's unorthodox thoughts. Cross denies possible Orphic influence. He renders verses 3 forward as follows. Oh, that the mountains would bear him witness. Oh, that the hills would tell of him. The trees recount his deeds, and the flock his works. Would that someone tell and speak, and would that someone recite his works. The Lord of all saw, the God of all heard, and he gave heed. He says here, Magne argues that 154 is the product of two authors, one who composed a wisdom psalm and a later author, or redactor, who added verses that called his sectarian brothers to participate in a cult in which glorification of God replaced sacrifices in the temple. That's a very long footnote here, but what we have here is the possibility of an Orphic David. Now, Orpheus was a figure in Greek mythology, often associated in the Jewish tradition with Moses in some ways, as either being the student of Moses or a teacher of Moses. This is part of Hellenistic Judaism. He's also a wisdom figure, a kind of Gnostic teacher in the Greek traditions of religion and mystery schools. But as we see Christ himself and other material being fused with imagery from Apollo, David himself is also being, in other cases, being fused with Orpheus, as both are shepherds. And as well, Apollo was, or not Apollo, excuse me, was it Dionysius? I believe it was Dionysius, but anyway, I don't want to try to give the wrong information here. But Christ is depicted in early Christianity with analogous features to certain Greek gods to emphasize his role as replacing them and in being in the role of those gods. And then he notes here concerning. I can try to find the right line here. The line handsome figure and handsome of appearance. He says a vaguely possible meaning in light of a possible chiastic construction with verse 6. Their hair handsome is to derive the meaning from TWR to obtain handsome with plaited hair. More probably derive HTWR from a defectively written toar, masculine form and outline. So that ends that there, and then we have from the Syriac. So we're going to jump over. Actually, I'm actually going to skip over because it's in a different order. After this, Psalm 151b, we have in the Hebrew another psalm that has been fused in the Syriac and Greek tradition with one psalm. And here we have it. 151b, 11Q Psalms A, 151 in Hebrew, at the beginning of David's power after the prophet of God had anointed him. So this psalm follows immediately after in the manuscript, but then the manuscript is damaged. And it simply states, Then I saw a Philistine who was uttering taunts from the ranks of the enemy. And then it breaks off. And the second line only preserves the two words I and the. So as he says here, the Dead Sea Scroll scroll preserves two psalms, A and B, which were truncated in the Greek and Syriac. Strugnal warns that it is uncertain whether this is a secondary text ever existed in Hebrew. Plate 17 of the Psalm Scroll shows, however, that a portion of it is preserved in 11Q Psalms A. The manuscript is severely damaged at this place. So originally, this as I already said before, I want to try to say it over and over again, but Psalm 151 was originally two psalms that had been severely truncated and preserved only in the Greek and Syriac in a much shorter form. And the Syriac is based upon the Greek, and all we have of the Dead Sea Scroll version of the second psalm that became one psalm is this fragmented line. Now that leaves us with the Syriac, and I'm going to read the I'm going to read the Greek next. It's not here in this version, so I'm actually going to read it from a Bible of mine, actually, so I can read you the psalm from a Greek translation. And I'm reading this from the ESV with the Apocrypha included, Deuterocanon, as I call it, Psalm 151. Let me see if I can get to it first. And as it's preserved in the Septuagint, it goes like this. Okay. I forget which order these are in, actually. First Esdras. Goodness, I'm getting lost. This is what you do when you don't have a script. Page 178. Okay. We'll get this in just a second. Flipping through pages. Weather's been nice. We're almost there. 4 more pages. Got it. All right. So in the Septuagint tradition, where Psalm 151 A and B were truncated into a single psalm, the ending of which was lost, is preserved thus. Psalm 151, its heading states, "This psalm is ascribed to David as his own composition, though it is outside the number, after he had fought in single combat with Goliath." And after the words "the number," some manuscripts add "of the 150 psalms." And it reads thus: "I was small among my brothers and youngest in my father's house. I tended my father's sheep. My hands made a harp, my fingers fashioned a lyre. And who will declare it to my Lord? The Lord himself. He himself listens. It was he who sent his messenger and took me from my father's sheep and anointed me with his anointing oil. My brothers were handsome and tall, but the Lord was not satisfied with them. I went out to meet the Philistine, and he cursed me by his idols. But I drew his own sword, I beheaded him, and removed reproach from the children of Israel." And it says some manuscripts state he himself will hear me, and some manuscripts add to everything or to me. And the messenger could be translated angel. This is of course referring to Samuel, but perhaps being understood as an angel in this version. And the Philistine can also be rendered is also a foreigner. So as we can see here, it's only down to 7 verses, while in the other version, it's also 7 verses, but each verse is much bigger. So we have this truncated version of Psalm 151 in the Greek, and that is how it's preserved there. And this was translated from the Hebrew. Now the Syriac, as we have it, was based upon the Greek, and so here we have Psalm 151 A and B. In the Syriac, and its heading is, "By David when he alone fought against Goliath." 151a. "I was the smallest of my brothers, and a child of my father's house. I was tending my father's flocks, and I discovered a lion and a wolf, and I killed and rent them." So there's that interpolation line. "My hands made instruments, and my fingers fashioned lyres. And who will declare my Lord, that is the Lord, that is my God? He sent his angel and removed me from the sheep of my father, and anointed me with the ointment of his anointing. My brothers were handsome and majestic, but the Lord did not choose them." He states here the title is from manuscript A, which states "Another Psalm of David, supernumerary," and then he has the Septuagint here that I've already read, the heading there. Child here in the Syriac denotes one between the ages of 7 and 12 years. This is a very young representation of David here. And I kill them and rent them. He says this line is placed in the margin of manuscript A, is missing in JRL Syriac 7. It says the participle in the line, find the right one here, the line declare, the participle can denote the future. The modal coloring of the participle can also be employed, literally, and who is he who may declare or make manifest my Lord? So we have this kind of same question of who can understand God, who can declare or manifest or make manifest God. He says, note the mixed traditions. In the Syriac 7, he is the Lord God who hears me. Ignoring the punctuation, the preceding line is corrupt. The Septuagint, the Lord himself, he hears everything. So interesting change here in the version. There's some little variations here within the manuscript that aren't very important. And then 151b, which is part of the same psalm here in the Syriac. 151b in Syriac, text is continuous with 151a to verses 1 to 5 in Syriac, states, I went out to attack the Philistine, and he cursed me by his idols. But after I unsheathed my sword, I cut off his head, and I removed the shame from the sons of Israel. So this is part of the same psalm, but as we said, this was part of two psalms put together as one. He says the root of the verb in PK is used to denote a military attack. In JRL Syriac 7, it reads, I invaded or attacked the land of the Philistine. In the same manuscript, it adds "and with it" from the Septuagint, from him, in the line "house from the house of Israel." So that's Psalm 151. That's everything from the Hebrew. The two psalms in the Hebrew, the last of which is mostly missing, when it was fused together into a single psalm and truncated in the Greek and Septuagint as one psalm, and material modified in it, and eventually translated into Syriac along with 4 other psalms, in which it was remained truncated. So that explains it. That is the entire history of Psalm 151, which in itself is one of the oldest psalms out of this Apocryphal collection, and has made it all the way into the Eastern Orthodox tradition, has survived to this day. Close my stuff here. So I hope that wasn't all too, in just my headset here, I hope that wasn't all too confusing, but that's the very complex history of the material in Psalm 151. So the more you know. So now we have the 4 remaining psalms, and these are going to be much easier because we only have to deal with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Syriac tradition that preserved this material. And there's less footnotes here, so this will be a little quicker. We're going to actually spend more time probably on this one psalm here. So now we move on to Psalm 152. He states here, the original language of this psalm, which is extant only in Syriac, may be Hebrew. In verse 1, the noun for God is Il, which is parallel to the Hebrew word for God, El, not the Syriac name for God, Allah. Likewise, in verse 6, I'm going to spell out the Aramaic word here, DWNYWHY, I'm not sure how I'm going to pronounce that, looks like a probably confused transliteration of the Hebrew word for Lord, DWNY, whereas the Syriac name for Lord is Maria. Comparisons with Psalms 151 and 54 and 55, which are extant in Hebrew and were composed in Hebrew, demonstrate the poor poetic character of this psalm. It seems derivative, uninspired, and a mimic of biblical poetry. It's a little bit harsh. It is impossible to date this psalm. The general tone, Jewish, but not in rabbinic character, and association with Psalms 51, 54, and 55 indicate that it was probably composed by a Palestinian Jew during the Hellenistic period. He says here, Strugno thinks that Psalms 52 to 55 certainly derived from a Hebrew text. This conclusion is open to debate. There is no evidence that they were in the Qumran library. While 51, 54, and 55 in the Syriac show clear evidence of a Hebrew base, 52 and 53 are notably different. And we're going to get on to 53 right after this. So 52 and 53, interestingly, could have been in Hebrew, but it's debatable. But we do know 54 and 55 were in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it is possible. it is plausible that all of these psalms were originally from the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew and were translated in to Syriac. However, interestingly, the material we have, Psalm 151, has been edited and changed from the Septuagint. So very interesting. Where did these scribes get this material? So it kind of begs the question exactly what was going on and why were they getting these one from the Septuagint, these other material seemingly from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and possibly having a Hebrew base for 52 and 53. Now, Psalm 152, its heading is spoken by David after fighting against the lion and the wolf, which took sheep from his flocks. He notes here, before we read, he says the title is from manuscript A. The above translation differs from Sanders' idiomatic rendering. Because I have attempted to be literal, I have occasionally used different manuscripts and have translated cognate words in these Hebrew and Syriac texts consistently, often missing a beautiful phrase in English. And so the psalm is thus: O God, come to my help, assist me and save me, and deliver me from the killers. Shall I descend to Sheol by the mouth of the lion, or shall the lion maim me? Is it not sufficient for them to ambush my father's flocks, and to tear a sheep from his sheepfold? They are even wishing to slay me. Spare, O Lord, your elect one, and deliver your Holy One from destruction, so that he may continue praising you in all his times, and may praise your magnificent name. When you have saved him from the hands of destroying death, and when you have rescued my captivity from the mouths of beasts, quickly, O Adonai, send from your presence a Redeemer, and lift me up from the gaping abyss which is seeking to enclose me in its depths. So it's a very poetic expansion upon the story of David that he tells Saul, where he had killed a lion, killed a well, it depends. Lion, wolf. It's a bear in the original, but lion, wolf / bear in the Old Testament. And David himself, as we see in material in 2 Samuel, does this himself, expanding upon events in his own life in very poetic, exaggerative terms on purpose. But an apocryphal author writing in his name also is doing the very same thing here in Psalm 152. He says this line, speaking of the line, O God, come to my help. He says here is il fa le'ali. The choice of the Hebrew il, God seems deliberate to bring out the assonance with le'ali, to my help. So it's kind of a poetic, rolls off the tongue right here in Syriac. The usual meaning of the verb, I'm just checking these footnotes here. Accelerates death means the opposite here. And he notes here, he says me, the word me here, is written le-yafe, which is a Hebraism and denotes the nota accusativi, with a prefixed redundant le, the Syriac note of the accusative. This observation plus il, for God, may indicate that the psalm was translated from Hebrew. And so the Hebrew Adonai is employed. By Arab manuscripts, A reads his Lord. And so we have various footnotes here and the variations of it. But again, some evidence here of an original Hebrew composition. Now this is interesting because, again, this is following the material on David and his life. And so it would seem that we have a kind of narrative here. And this is how in the book of Psalms, some of the Psalms next to each other have a flowing kind of narrative to them. And this could be the case here. Now we move on to Psalm 153. This psalm is extant only in Syriac. The original language may be Hebrew, but there is even less evidence of that hypothesis for this psalm than there is for Psalm 152. The above statement regarding dating providence of Psalm 152 applies to 153 as well. So if Psalm 153, spoken by David after receiving God's grace when he delivered him from the lion and the wolf, and those two he killed by his hands. Praise the Lord, all you nations, glorify him and bless his name, for he delivered the physical life of his elect one from the hands of death, and he redeemed his holy one from destruction. And he saved me from the snares of Sheol, and brought me forth from the abyss that is inscrutable. Because before my salvation could proceed from before him, I almost became two parts by two beasts. However, he sent his angel and closed from me the gaping mouths, and redeemed my life from destruction. I myself shall praise him and exalt him because of all of his graces, which he has provided and is providing for me. And he has some footnotes here that aren't very important. So we have here a continuation of the previous psalm here. They kind of go together here, where the cry of David asking for help from God to be delivered from Sheol, or the grave, and God responding, and the saving David, and now David giving praise to God for his salvation. So these two psalms definitely go together and are a pair. Very similar, for example, to Psalms 1 and 2, which are considered messianic or royal psalms. They go together. So now we have the last two, which we're going to be reading twice because of the Syriac and the Hebrew versions. Psalm 154. The original language of this psalm is Hebrew. The Syriac derives directly from the Hebrew, but not necessarily from the Hebrew as preserved in 11q Psalms A. Because the psalm is preserved in this first century manuscript, it must date from the first, or better, the second century BC. There is no reason to doubt that it was composed somewhere in Palestine. Of Psalms 151 to 55, this one is most closely aligned with the thoughts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The many ones, or many, in verse 1, only in the Syriac, the Hebrew is lost, may be parallel to the many, a technical term, rabbim, that defines the fully initiated members of the Qumran community. The many, however, may be only a generic reference, as it is in verse 10 and Isaiah 53:11. The Hebrew of verse 4, which has been translated join an assembly, could be rendered join a yachad. The latter is a technical term at Qumran for the community of oneness in covenant with God. The phrase, oh, did I skip something? Oh, no, never mind, sorry. The phrase join or form a yachad, however, is not found elsewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other nouns that are technical terms at Qumran, but not necessarily ideas peculiar to the Dead Sea Scrolls, are the innocent ones in verse 3 and 18, and the poor ones in verse 18. Concepts cherished at Qumran are the ideas expressed in verse 10 forward, that the Most High accepts praise as equal to sacrifices, and in verse 13 forward, that the righteous share in common meals and constantly study the law. But these emphases are also characteristic of the prophets and the practices of other Jews, especially the Pharisees. It seems, therefore, that while there is nothing peculiarly Qumranian about Psalm 154, it may be Proto-Essene and predate the exodus of the Essenes to Qumran. So we could have our hands here in Essene Psalm. You could link against the possibility of these all being composed, but again, the similarities are too general. So the Dead Sea Scroll version we have here of Psalm 154 is missing its beginning and its end. So we have here in the Hebrew 154 in Hebrew, verse 1 is lost and verse 2 is lost. Verse 3 begins, associate yourselves with the good ones, and with the pure ones to glorify the Most High. Join in assembly to announce His salvation, and do not be lax to announce His power and His gloriousness to all simple ones. For to announce the glory or honor of the Lord, wisdom has been given, and to recount His many deeds, she was made known to humanity. To announce to simple ones His power, to explain to those lacking understanding His greatness, those far from her openings, those banished from her entrances. Because the Most High is the Lord of Jacob, and His gloriousness is over all His deeds, and a person who glorifies the Most High He accepts as one who brings a meal offering. As one who offers he-goats and baby bulls, as one who anoints the altar with many burnt offerings, as sweet-smelling fragrance with the hand of the righteous ones. From the openings of the righteous ones is heard her voice, and from the congregation of the pious ones her song. When they eat with satiety she is cited, and when they drink in association together. Their meditation is on the law of the Most High, their words to announce His power. How far from the wicked ones is her word, from all haughty ones to know her. Behold, the eyes of the Lord with all compassion upon the good ones, and upon those who glorify Him will He increase His mercy, from an evil time will He deliver them. Bless the Lord who redeems the poor ones from the hand of strangers and delivers. And then it breaks off here as the text is damaged. And verse 19 reads, Jacob and a judge of, and then breaks off. And finally, verse 20 is completely lost. So here we have a kind of scene here concerning an assembly of people who study the law of God. And as he said here, very similar to the idea of the equalness of praise. We see this in, of course, the Old Testament itself, the concept that prayer and praise of God and moral behavior is equivalent or even better than the actual ritual sacrifices that we see in the Old Testament. He says here in the notes, the Hebrew of verse 2 to A is lost. The verb associate is restored in the Syriac. The above translation is different from those now available because I've attempted to translate the Syriac and the Hebrew version so that cognate and corresponding words within each are easily recognized. So these will be consistent between both translations we are going to read. Um, um, Sanders, folk glory. No interesting language here of the wisdom, and I always want to point this out here. The understanding of wisdom, the wisdom principle, the logos, the word, as a female, the female character here, as we see in the book of Proverbs. She was made known to humanity, for example, and this is the idea of possibly here that wisdom is analogous to the Torah, as we find in the book of Syriac or Ecclesiasticus, where wisdom, the logos principle, is in fact also the law, the Torah. And you see this in the Gospel of John as well, where the Torah, in a sense, is also Christ. Christ himself is the Torah, the true Torah, not just the book, but the source of the book, the source of law. And this is kind of apparent here in this material, in this assembly of people who associate with wisdom. And the Syriac version of Psalm 154 has as a heading, and its heading is the prayer of Hezekiah when the Assyrians were surrounding him, and he was asking God deliverance from them so that the people might receive permission from Cyrus to return to the land, and they asked God to fulfill their expectation. And this is a hilarious heading because if this has nothing to do with the prayer for deliverance, necessarily, by Hezekiah, and the material so that they might receive permission from Cyrus to return to their land. Well, Cyrus isn't around yet. Now, this could be speaking in the sense that of Hezekiah asking for deliverance in the future, but it's a quite peculiar dual chronological heading with two different periods of time: the time of Hezekiah in the 8th century and the time of Cyrus in the 6th century. It's quite strange. In the Syriac goes as thus. In a great voice glorify God. In the congregation of the many ones proclaim his glory. In the multitude of the upright ones glorify his excellence, and with the faithful ones narrate his gloriousness. Associate yourselves with the good ones, and with the innocent ones to glorify the Most High. Gather together to announce his power, and do not neglect to declare his salvation and his glory to all children. So that the honor of the Lord shall be made known, wisdom has been given, and to narrate his works she has made known to humanity, to announce to children his power, and to explain to those lacking understanding his gloriousness, those who are far from her entrances and are dispersed from her gate, because the Most High is the Lord of Jacob, and his pride is over all his works. And a person who glorifies the Most High, he accepts as one who offers a meal offering, and as one who offers he-goats and baby bulls, and as he who anoints the altar with many burnt offerings, and as sweet-smelling fragrance from the hand of the righteous ones. From the gates of the just ones is heard her voice, and from the voice of the just ones her admonition. And concerning their food fullness is in truth, and concerning their feast their portions are together. Their discussions are on the law of the Most High, and their word is to announce his power. How far from the wicked ones is her word, and from all evil ones her understanding. Behold, the eye of the Lord will have pity upon the good ones, and upon those who glorify him will he increase mercies, and from an evil time he will redeem them. Blessed be the Lord, who saves the poor ones from the hand of strangers, and redeems the innocent ones from the hand of the evil ones, who raises the horn from Jacob, and the judge of the nations from Israel, so that he may prolong his sojourn in Zion, and may cause adornment forever in Jerusalem. Z notes here the title is from manuscript A, but it is very late and has little relation to the content of the psalm. He says here, the congregation of many is a technical term in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it probably no longer retained this meaning in later Syriac-speaking churches. The term infant, the noun is plural and frequently denotes boys and girls under 5 years old. It's interesting. The manuscript A incorrectly has added the Nestorian vocalization for the first person singular pronoun, and again the Nestorian vocalization in elsewhere is incorrectly first common singular. Nestorian would be the Assyrian tradition. The term Nestorian is outdated, although this book is from the 80s as well. The translation here of the line, if I can correctly from those lacking understanding, literally those in want of a heart or mind. But both the Syriac and Hebrew phrases really mean those who are senseless or stupid. The Semite thought of his chest or breast as the place of intelligence and feeling. So instead of in the head, the feeling is in the chest, for example. As we see in the Psalms itself, David speaks of his kidneys or his reins being a place of emotions, for example. So there's a different understanding of quote unquote biology of the ancient authors. He says here the exhortation is to bless the Lord so he will prolong his habitation in Jerusalem. And the final note here, he says on the line, and may cause adornment, he says, according to extant lexicons, SBT, that's a sh S, by the way, is not used in the afel, but the meaning, form, and Nestorian vocalization indicate that here it is an afel. So we have a little bit change here between the Nestorian Syriac tradition here, aka the Assyrian Church of the East, as they're correctly called. And so that is the Syriac version of the text. Now what's interesting is we actually have the ending portion here, and we have a kind of messianic expectation, who raises the horn from Jacob and the judge of the nations from Israel. So we have a messianic expectation here of the judge and the horn, for example. And this is very similar to the Essenes. So it is completely possible that this was composed by the Essenes, because we have this language we have this messianic expectation, the material of a judge of the nations. But then again, all Jews did, so, or at least most of them did. So this is not exactly unique, but it's consistent, we could say. And so now we have the final psalm, Psalm 155, both in Hebrew and in the Syriac. Psalm 151. Hebrew is the original language of the psalm. As with Psalm 154, the Syriac appears to derive directly from the Hebrew. This psalm is not Qumranian, but biblical. It is similar in style to Psalm 22. Since it is extant in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it must date at least from the 1st century BC and is probably much earlier. The Syriac translator is gifted. He cannot be identified with the author of Psalms 152 and 53, if one were to assume a Syriac original for them. Like most of the canonical or Masoretic psalms, the psalm is generic in thought and tone. Hence, it is impossible to discern its author, date, or provenance. So it's a very general psalm, but as we shall see here, it's actually quite a nice psalm. So in the Hebrew, there is no title for it in the Hebrew, although it does have one in the Syriac. It reads thus: Psalm 151. O Lord, I called unto you, be attentive to me. I spread forth my palms toward your holy dwelling. Incline your ear, and give me my request. And my petition do not hold back from me. Build me up, and do not cast me down, and do not abandon me before the wicked ones. The rewards of evil may the judge of truth remove from me. O Lord, do not condemn me according to my sins, for no one living is righteous before you. O Lord, instruct me in your law, and teach me your statutes, so many may hear of your deeds, and nations may honor your magnificence. Remember me, and do not forget me, and do not let me enter that which is too difficult for me. The sins of my youth cast far from me, and my transgressions do not remember against me. O Lord, purify me from the evil plague, and do not let it turn back to me. Dry up its roots from me, and do not let its leaves bloom in me. Magnificent are you, O Lord, hence complete my request from before you. To whom may I cry, and he would to whom may I cry, and he would give to me? And human beings, what can their power add? From before you, O Lord, is my trust. I called, O Lord, and he answered me, and he healed my broken heart. I slumbered and I slept. I dreamed, nevertheless. And then it breaks off in the Hebrew, and the verses 19 to 21 are all lost. So it's interesting out of all of this here is this peculiar language, O Lord, purify me from the evil plague, and do not let it again turn back to me. So we have this language in the Psalms speaking out plagues, and this is a very complex rabbit hole, actually having to deal with Canaanite demons and gods, for example. So this could be influence there of these evil spirits being referred to as plagues, for example. But dry up its roots from me, and do not let its leaves bloom in me. So this is some very interesting language here about like a blooming evil plant within you. It's very, very fascinating. And then we have 155 in the Syriac, and it has a heading. Um, uh, it is also late, also very late, and has nothing to do with the psalm really. But it says, "The prayer of Hezekiah when the Assyrians surrounded him, and he asked God deliverance from them." And reads thus: O Lord, I called to you, hearken to me. I stretched out my hands to the dwellings of your holiness. Incline your ear and grant me my request. My prayer do not withhold from me. Build me up and do not destroy me, and do not uncover me before the wicked ones. The reward of evil turn from me, O judge of truth. O Lord, do not judge me according to my sins, because guilty before you is every life. O Lord, explain to me your law, and teach me your judgments, so that many may hear of your works, and the nations may give thanks for your honor. Remember me and do not forget me, and do not let me enter that which is too difficult for me. The sins of my childhood remove from me, and my insolence do not remember against me. O Lord, cleanse me from the evil leprosy, and do not let it again return to me. Dry up its roots from me, and do not let its leaves bud in me. Powerful and great are you, O Lord, hence my request will be fulfilled from before you. To whom may I complain, and he would give to me? And human beings, what can their strength add for me? From before you, O Lord, is my confidence. I called to the Lord, and he answered me, and he healed my broken heart. I slumbered and slept. I dreamed, nevertheless I was aroused. And you support me, O Lord, and I shall render thanks because the Lord has delivered me. Now I shall behold their shame. I trusted in you and shall not be ashamed. Give honor to the Lord forever and ever. Save Israel, your elect one, and those of the house of Jacob, your chosen one. So again, very beautiful psalm here. Um, Nothing to note here so far in the notes. Um, just always checking the. There's actually a lot of notes, but these are all fairly unimportant material for what we're looking at here. Um, um, Copying margins, scrolls condition, divine voice of the Lord. I was helped. And he says here, at the end of the collection of the Psalms, a scribe adds a manuscript A. So this ends the five Psalms we're reading here. So ends, by the assistance of our Lord, the writing of the Psalms of the blessed David, the prophet and king, with the five Psalms which are not among the Greek or Hebrew numbering. However, as they are said, and preserved in Syriac, so we have copied them for him who desires a copy. And that ends all the material here we have on the Apocryphal Psalms. Thank you to the Syriac author who ended that there. So that concludes the five Psalms. Extra material. And there is much more that's outside these five, but these are what are part of this. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Syriac, and of course the Greek. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are many more Psalms material there, but we just focused on these. For example, there is in the material in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are several eschatological hymns, or there's an eschatological hymn, a hymn to Zion, a hymn to Judah, an entreaty for deliverance. The Psalms we've already read here, Psalm 154, a hymn to wisdom, which is it's the same material we find in from the writings of Ben Sira, the book of Sirach, other hymn to Zion, and there are many of these compositions that are included in the 11Q Psalms manuscript that are unique to itself. And there's also material ascribed to David of exorcism psalms, material attributed to Manasseh, anonymous kings, prayer of Obadiah. There's many of these material that we're not going to cover here, but I think for the next episode I'm actually going to do that. I think for the next episode we're going to be looking at the apocryphal Dead Sea Scroll Psalms, and that's what I'll cover there. It's a kind of continuation of this because we only looked at this specific material here. Well, that's what we'll do because, as I said before, I'll kind of end the podcast on this. These Syriac authors thought to preserve them. Now, whatever you think of the quality of the actual text doesn't really matter. These were important for some people, and they used them. And they were lost today, and we only have Psalm 151, which itself originally was two psalms, which were condensed into one, and material was lost. And it's the condensed milk version, But all of this material has likely survived for us to study and use, but it doesn't diminish it, though it's not included in a specific canon. Because, like I said, at some point these could become accepted. And the concept of canon is fluid. So why, for example, did these scribes include them? They said, well, they're good for use. People should read them. Now we're going to include them with the Book of Psalms. And this can happen a lot with other biblical material where we have stuff appended to certain books of the Bible. Someone added material to our Old Testament, to preserve them. Frankly, it's like the book of Proverbs. There's material that's added to it to ensure that we preserve material and have heritage. For example, the material in the Gospel of John, the woman caught in adultery, is not originally part of the Gospel of John. It is its own composition. It is literally a fifth Gospel author. Whoever he was, we don't know. It's material from somewhere else. And in the early church, the woman caught in adultery story was added to the end of the Gospel of Luke, or at some point in it, or, as it is most commonly preserved, in the Gospel of John. Even though it originally was not part of it, it's now recognized as its own unique composition. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and an anonymous guy who wrote the story of the woman caught in adultery. And so someone added that there to preserve it. Because it was very important, an authentic tradition of Jesus that needed to be retained. And so thankfully it was there. Now it was one of the most famous stories of Jesus ever. It's one of the most interesting and fascinating stories told of Christ. And so the same thing is true for the Psalms here. If people did not preserve these Psalms, we might not have found the Dead Sea Scrolls. We might not have had these. And it shows us that just because a book is not in the canon does not mean it should not be read or even put in under the covers of a Bible necessarily. Because in other traditions, for example, in the Syriac tradition or Armenian churches, different Bibles would have different material added to them. And so if it wasn't, for example, Slavic authors preserving the book of Second Esdras, or Armenian or Greek authors preserving the book of Fourth Maccabees, we might not have actually had them, even though they're not officially recognized as necessarily canonical. Or, for example, a Syriac tradition or church preserving the Apocalypse of Baruch, which is actually part of their canon. If those texts were not at least considered important to be important, they wouldn't have been included in the collection of Bibles that they actually had, which is, pretty small. They didn't have the printing press, and so Bibles were hard to come by and very important. They concluded these texts, though they might not be scripture, although some did think they were scripture, needed to be preserved. And so we can thank those ancient authors for doing so, and in putting this material in Bibles, or at least considering them scripture in their own day, because it has given us the ability to look back in the past and see what people wrote, and see how canons have fluctuated and changed. And it is this kind of fluid nature, as I mentioned at the beginning of this an hour ago. It is this fluid nature of the canon that has enabled us to actually have many of these books handed down to us, because the Ethiopian Church, with its very broad canon, has preserved books solely only found in Ethiopic. We only have the complete Book of Jubilees and Enoch in the Ge'ez. And so if it wasn't for them accepting that book, regardless of if the book is canonical to any other tradition, inspired or whatever opinion you have over it, if it wasn't for that, it wouldn't be there. And so if it wasn't for these authors in the Syriac preserving all of these, we would not have the full text of at least Psalms 154 to 55. We would only had damaged versions found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and perhaps these other ones might not have been preserved at all. And so this, as I said, I'm just going to say it over and over again, it adds to the interesting nature. So for the next episode, what we're going to do is we're probably going to go over the Dead Sea Scrolls material, specifically 11Q Psalms A that I mentioned earlier. We're going to read the material that's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls ascribed to David, so the Qumran Davidic Apocryphon particularly, and also probably go over the other. We're going to include other material ascribed to different authors in these psalms, like a apocryphal prayer of Manasseh, not to be confused with that found in the Apocrypha or in the Bibles of the Eastern Orthodox. This is a different composition, and a prayer to Obadiah, for example. And then after that, I think we can also cover a text that was discovered at the Cairo Geniza. Is the Jewish work called the Songs of David. I actually almost forgot about it existing, but it is in the same kind of category of an apocryphal Davidic psalm-like material. I think we can cover that afterward, because it has similarities to the Qumran material. It actually might be from Qumran. So in this case, it actually would tie all three of these together as coming from Qumran in some way, part of the Essene tradition. And so that's what we'll cover. That kind of like sets the next two episodes of the podcast in order as what we're going to be covering. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, Psalms, and Apocryphal Psalms, and the Songs of David. So that's what we'll probably be doing next. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from all that. And yeah, I think I got everything covered. So I will see you all on the other side.